The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble floors of the royal palace, and Daniel Cooper pushed his cleaning cart down the silent hallway with steady movements that came from years of practice, and nobody looked at him because servants were meant to be invisible. His gray uniform was clean but worn at the edges, and his weathered hands gripped the mop handle with quiet strength, and on his shoulder sat a small red dragon, no bigger than a parrot, and in his cart, another dragon with blue scales peeked out from between the cleaning supplies. The palace of Queen Lyria was the most beautiful building on planet Silvara, with its towers reaching toward 3 moons and walls made of white stone that seemed to glow in the sunlight. And Daniel had worked here for 2 years cleaning these same floors every day, and listening to conversations that people thought he could not hear. That morning the palace was buzzing with unusual activity because human visitors were coming, and the elvish nobles were nervous about meeting these strange beings from a distant planet called Earth. Daniel paused near a large window and looked out at the landing pad, where palace guards were arranging themselves in neat rows, and his red dragon, Ember, chirped softly, and he scratched under her chin, while his blue dragon Frost climbed out of the cart to sit beside them. An elvish noble named Lord Varen walked past, talking loudly to his companion about how humans were dangerous and could not be trusted, and how Queen Lyria was making a mistake by inviting them to discuss treaties. Daniel said nothing and continued mopping the floor, and Varen did not even glance at him because why would an important lord notice a simple janitor? The great doors of the palace opened and the human delegation entered, and they wore dark uniforms with strange symbols on their shoulders and moved with military precision that made the elvish guards look almost relaxed by comparison. Their leader was a woman named Amanda Price with steel gray hair pulled back in a tight knot and eyes that seemed to calculate everything they saw, and she did not smile when Queen Lyria greeted her in the entrance hall. Daniel watched from the corner where he was dusting a statue, and he noticed how Amanda's hand stayed close to the weapon on her belt, even though palace rules said visitors must come unarmed, and he saw how her eyes swept the room, cataloging every exit and every guard position. Queen Lyria was young for an elvish ruler, only 300 years old, and she wore robes of deep purple that matched the evening sky, and her silver hair flowed down her back like water, and she welcomed the humans with formal words that had been carefully prepared by her advisors. Amanda responded with equally formal words about friendship between species and mutual benefit, and trade agreements, and all the usual things that diplomats said when they wanted something. The 2 groups moved toward the council chamber, and Daniel followed at a distance, pushing his cart because the council chamber would need cleaning after the meeting, and servants were allowed to prepare rooms in advance. He positioned himself in an alcove where he could hear everything, while appearing to polish the silver candlesticks that lined the walls, and Ember and Frost stayed very still. Because they understood the game their master played, Amanda Price laid out her proposal, and humans wanted to mine the crystal caves beneath Silvara's northern mountains, and in exchange they would provide advanced technology and military protection, and she showed holographic displays of human weapons and ships that made the elvish advisors whisper among themselves. Lord Varen spoke up and said that humans had destroyed many worlds with their mining and left them as empty husks. And why should Silvara trust them? Amanda's expression did not change, and she replied that humans had also saved many worlds from invasion and starvation, and their technology had extended lives and cured diseases across the galaxy. Queen Lyria listened carefully and asked what kind of military threats would require human protection, and Amanda's face grew serious. She explained that the Kreth Empire had been expanding aggressively and had already conquered 12 systems in this sector, and Silvara was directly in their path, and elvish defenses would not be enough to stop them. The room fell silent, because everyone knew about the Kreth and their massive warships and their habit of enslaving entire populations. Daniel continued polishing candlesticks and thought about the Kreth and remembered fighting them long ago in a different age when he had a different name and commanded forces that could shatter planets. One of the junior advisors asked how soon the Kreth might attack, and Amanda said intelligence suggested they could arrive within months or even weeks. Lord Varen argued that accepting human help would make Silvara dependent on Earth, and Queen Lyria held up her hand for silence and said she would consider the proposal carefully and give her answer in 3 days. The meeting ended, and the humans were escorted to guest quarters, and the elvish advisors scattered to their own chambers to argue among themselves. Daniel pushed his cart out of the alcove and began actually cleaning the council chamber, and Ember flew down to help by picking up fallen papers in her tiny claws, and Frost used his tail to sweep dust from corners. Queen Lyria had not left with the others, and she stood by the window looking out at the city below. And Daniel worked quietly and tried not to disturb her thoughts. But she turned and looked at him directly and asked how long he had been working at the palace. Daniel straightened and said, 2 years, Your Majesty, and kept his voice respectful and humble. She studied him with those ancient elvish eyes that had seen centuries pass and asked if he always brought his dragons to work, replied that Ember and Frost went everywhere with him, and they were well trained and caused no trouble. Lyria smiled slightly and said that most people would give anything to bond with even one dragon, and yet a janitor had 2, and she found that interesting. Daniel said that life was full of surprises and went back to his cleaning. The queen watched him for another moment, and then left the room, and her footsteps echoed down the marble hallway. When she was gone, Ember landed on Daniel's shoulder and made a questioning sound. He whispered that they needed to be more careful because the queen was smarter than most, and she had started to notice things. Frost chirped in agreement, and Daniel looked out the window at the stars beginning to appear. In the darkening sky, somewhere out there the Kreth were coming, and soon this peaceful planet would face a choice between human alliance or Kreth invasion. And Daniel knew that his quiet life as a janitor was about to end. The second day of the human visit brought tension that hung in the palace air like smoke. And Daniel arrived before dawn as always, and found the hallways filled with extra guards, and their hands rested on weapons as they watched every shadow with suspicious eyes. Ember and Frost sensed the nervous energy and stayed closer to Daniel than usual, and the blue dragon tucked himself completely into the cleaning cart, while the red one made herself look like a brooch pinned to his uniform. Daniel was mopping the floor outside the guest quarters when he heard voices inside, and Amanda Price was speaking to her second-in-command, a man named Kyle Turner, about their backup plans. Kyle said that if the elves refused the treaty, then Command wanted them to survey the crystal caves anyway and take samples without permission, and Amanda replied that stealing from potential allies was a poor strategy, but orders were orders. Daniel kept mopping, and his face showed nothing but Ember's eyes glowed, brighter for just a moment. Further down the hall, Queen Lyria was meeting with her inner council, and Daniel could hear them through the ventilation system that carried sound in strange ways through the old palace. Lord Varen was arguing loudly that the humans were obviously desperate for the crystals, which meant Silvara could demand better terms, and another advisor named Lady Helena countered that desperation also made humans dangerous, and rejecting them might trigger an aggressive response. The Queen asked her military commander, General Caney, about their actual defensive capabilities, and the general admitted that Silvara had patrol ships and ground batteries, but nothing that could stand against a Kreth invasion force. Lord Varen said they should ally with the Meridian Consortium instead, but Lady Helena pointed out that the consortium was 3 months' travel away and would not arrive in time if the Kreth attacked. Soon Daniel finished the hallway and moved to the library, where he found Amanda Price sitting alone reading from a datapad, and she looked up when he entered and for the first time actually seemed to see him. She asked if he enjoyed working at the palace, and Daniel said it was peaceful work, and he appreciated peace. Amanda studied him with those calculating eyes and mentioned that she had noticed his dragons and said they were beautiful creatures, and asked where he had found them. Daniel replied that they had found him many years ago and had been his companions ever since, and some bonds could not be explained, only accepted. She nodded slowly and said that Earth legends spoke of dragons, but they had never found any, and seeing real ones was remarkable. And then she asked if dragons were common. On Silvara, he said they were rare and most elves never saw one in their lifetime, and she should feel honored that Ember and Frost allowed her to be near them. Amanda stood and walked closer and said that there was something unusual about him, and she had met many janitors in many places, and none of them carried themselves quite the way he did. Daniel smiled and said that everyone had a story, and his was simply longer than most. Before Amanda could respond, an alarm began blaring throughout. The palace and guards ran past shouting orders, and Daniel and Amanda rushed to the windows. In the sky above the city, 3 large ships were descending, and they were not elvish designs, and they were not human ships either, and their hulls were covered in dark metal that seemed to absorb light. The Kreath had arrived early. Palace guards rushed the human delegation toward secure bunkers, and Amanda protested that her team needed to get to their shuttle. But General Caney said the landing pads were exposed and too dangerous. Queen Lyria appeared in the hallway surrounded by advisors, and her face was pale but composed, and she ordered all civilians to shelter areas and called for her military staff. Daniel stood still in the chaos and watched through the window as Kreath dropships landed in the city plaza, and armored soldiers poured out and began setting up weapon emplacements. Frost climbed out of the cleaning cart and onto Daniel's shoulder, joining Ember, and both dragons made low, growling sounds that no one else seemed to hear over the alarms. A Kreath transmission came through on all palace channels, and a harsh voice demanded that Queen Lyria surrender immediately and accept Kreath authority over Silvara and all its resources, and resistance would result in the destruction of major cities starting in 1 hour. The transmission ended, and Lord Varen looked at the Queen and said they had no choice but to surrender because fighting was suicide. Lady Helena argued they should try to hold out until help arrived from somewhere, and General Caney sadly reported that palace shields could withstand bombardment for perhaps 3 hours before failing. Amanda Price stepped forward and said that her shuttle had weapons and could buy them time, and the human fleet was only 2 days away if they could hold out. Queen Lyria looked at her and asked why humans would risk their lives for a planet that had not even agreed to their treaty. Amanda replied that allowing the Kreath to take Silvara would give them a strategic position to threaten human colonies, and besides, some things were simply the right thing to do, regardless of treaties. The Queen made her decision and ordered General Caney to coordinate with the humans and prepare for defense, and then she told everyone to get to their positions. The group scattered, and Daniel remained standing with his mop and bucket and his 2 dragons. Queen Lyria noticed him and said sharply that he needed to get to a shelter immediately, because janitors were not soldiers. Daniel looked at her and asked if she truly believed that. Something in his tone made her pause, and she looked at him more carefully and asked what he meant. He said that sometimes people were not what they appeared to be, and sometimes a queen needed to trust her instincts even when they seemed impossible. Lyria stared at him, and her ancient eyes widened slightly as understanding began to dawn. Before she could speak, another explosion rocked the palace, and the Kreath had begun their bombardment. Early windows shattered and stone cracked, and guards shouted orders, and Daniel remained perfectly calm. He spoke a single word in a language that had not been heard on Silvara for 3,000 years, and Ember and Frost began to glow with inner fire. The dragons launched from his shoulders and grew as they flew, and within seconds they were the size of horses, and then elephants, and then larger still. They crashed through the palace roof and kept growing, and their roar shook the foundations of the building. Everyone in the hallway fell silent and stared upward at the massive holes in the ceiling, where 2 dragon shapes could be seen against the sky, growing larger with each passing moment. Queen Lyria looked at Daniel and whispered a name from ancient history and asked if it was really him. Daniel's appearance began to change, and his gray hair darkened and his weathered face grew young and strong, and he stood straighter and taller, and the simple janitor uniform seemed suddenly inadequate for the power that radiated from him. He said that yes, he was Daniel Stormrider, the last of the Dragon Lords, and he had been hiding for a very long time, but some threats required old powers to awaken, and the Kreath were about to learn why dragons were feared across the galaxy. Frost and Ember rose into the sky like twin stars, and their scales reflected the light of 3 moons, and their wings spread wide enough to cast shadows over entire city blocks, and the Kreath soldiers in the plaza looked up, and for the first time in their military careers they felt genuine fear. Daniel walked calmly toward the broken palace wall and stepped out onto empty air, and he did not fall because dragon lords did not obey the same rules as ordinary beings. Queen Lyria and her advisors crushed to the edge and watched as Daniel floated upward to meet his dragons, and his simple janitor clothes transformed into armor that seemed made of starlight and storm clouds. Amanda Price stood beside the Queen and whispered that human intelligence had no records of anything like this, and Lyria replied that most people thought the Dragon Lords were only myths and legends told to children. Lord Varen asked what a Dragon Lord actually was, and the Queen explained that 3,000 years ago, they had been guardians of peace across hundreds of worlds, and each one bonded with dragons and wielded power that could reshape planets. But they had vanished after the Great War, and everyone assumed they had died or abandoned the galaxy. Daniel reached his dragons and placed one hand on Frost's neck and one on Ember's, and spoke to them in that ancient language, and they responded with sounds that were part roar and part song. The Kreth commander in the largest ship broadcast another message, demanding surrender and threatened to destroy the palace in 60 seconds. Daniel looked at the Kreth fleet, and his eyes blazed with blue fire. He raised one hand, and lightning erupted from clear sky, and struck the Kreth command ship, and shields flickered and failed, and the ship's hull cracked like an eggshell. The commander stopped talking. Frost dove toward the Kreth ground forces and opened his mouth, and blue ice poured out like a river, and froze soldiers in their armor and turned weapon. Emplacements into sculptures of frost ember targeted the smaller Kreth ships and breathed fire that burned hotter than stars, and metal melted and systems exploded and ships fell from the sky, trailing smoke. Daniel stood between his dragons and directed their assault with small gestures, and the three of them moved like they were one being with three bodies. The Kreth tried to fight back, and their weapons fired energy beams and missiles and plasma charges, but everything that came near Daniel simply stopped in midair and fell harmlessly to the ground. A Kreth battlecruiser broke formation and tried to flee into orbit, but Frost caught it with his claws and crushed it like paper. The remaining Kreth forces began retreating, and their discipline collapsed into panic, and soldiers abandoned their positions, and ships launched without waiting for clearance and crashed into each other. Within 20 minutes, the entire Kreth invasion force was destroyed or running away. Daniel descended back to the palace, and his dragons shrank as they came down until they were small enough to land on his shoulders again. And by the time his feet touched the broken floor, he looked like a janitor once more. Except his eyes still held that ancient power, and everyone could see it now. Queen Lyria approached slowly and asked why he had hidden his identity and pretended to be a servant. Daniel said that after the Great War he had grown tired of being worshipped and feared, and tired of making decisions that affected billions of lives, and he wanted peace and quiet and a simple existence. So he had disguised himself and wandered from world to world, and worked ordinary jobs and observed ordinary life, and learned what it meant to be unremarkable. He had been happy as a janitor, and honestly he was a bit annoyed that the Kreth had forced him to reveal himself. Lord Varen recovered from his shock and demanded to know why Daniel had not helped them sooner, if he was so powerful, and why he had let them worry about the human treaty when he could have protected Silvara alone. Daniel turned to him and said that he was one person, and could not be everywhere, and could not solve every problem, and part of growing as a civilization was learning to make difficult choices and build alliances and stand on your own strength. He had intervened against the Kreth only because immediate invasion required immediate response, but Silvara still needed to decide its own future. Amanda Price cleared her throat and said that the human offer still stood, and now that the immediate threat was gone, they could negotiate without pressure. Queen Lyria looked thoughtful and asked Daniel if he would advise her on the treaty. He said he would, but only as a janitor who had opinions and not as a dragon lord, giving commands because she was the queen and the decision was hers. Over the next 2 days, Daniel returned to his cleaning duties while diplomats argued about treaty terms, and his dragons helped him mop floors and dust shelves, and gradually, the palace began to feel normal again. But now when Daniel walked through hallways, everyone bowed, and he hated it. He complained to Ember that being recognized ruined everything, and she chirped sympathetically. Queen Lyria finally reached an agreement with Amanda, and humans would get limited mining rights with strict environmental protections, and in exchange they would establish a defense station and provide technology sharing, and both sides seemed satisfied. At the signing ceremony, Daniel stood in the back of the room with his mop and watched as Lyria and Amanda shook hands. Afterward, the queen found him and asked if he planned to stay on Silvara or disappear again. Daniel said he had grown fond of this planet and its people, and perhaps he would stay a while longer, but he wanted to go back to being invisible if possible. Lyria smiled and said that was impossible now because everyone knew who he was. He sighed and said that was the problem with saving worlds, and people never let you forget it. She suggested a compromise and offered him a position as royal advisor, with no public duties, and he could continue living quietly, but she could consult him when needed. Daniel considered this and said he would accept on one condition, and she must promise to make her own decisions and not rely on him to solve every problem. The Queen agreed, and they shook hands. That evening, Daniel was mopping the Great Hall when a group of young elves approached nervously and asked if they could see his dragons. He looked at their excited faces and remembered being young once and eager to see magic. He whistled, and Ember and Frost performed aerial tricks, and the children laughed, and clapped. An older elf nearby muttered that the great dragon lord was entertaining children like a common street performer. And Daniel heard him and smiled. He thought that being a common street performer sounded rather nice, actually. Later that night, when the palace was quiet, Daniel stood on a balcony and looked at the stars, and Ember and Frost sat beside him. Amanda Price found him there and said she was returning to Earth but wanted to thank him for saving her team. Daniel said she had been willing to fight alongside the elves, and that took courage. She asked if he had really lived for thousands of years and seen the rise and fall of civilizations, and he said yes, and it was both wonderful and exhausting. Amanda said she could not imagine living that long. And Daniel replied that the trick was to find joy in small things and to remember that every moment was new, even if you had lived 1,000,000 moments before. She nodded and said, perhaps humans and elves had more to learn from each other than just technology and trade. Daniel agreed and watched her leave. Frost made a questioning sound, and Daniel scratched the dragon's chin. He said that maybe being discovered was not entirely terrible, and maybe this world needed a Dragon Lord after all, at least for a little while. And then perhaps he could find another planet and another quiet job. Maybe next time he would try being a gardener. 3 weeks after the Kreth defeat, Daniel discovered that being a known Dragon Lord made simple janitor work nearly impossible, and nobles kept stopping him to ask questions, and guards saluted when he passed, and children followed him everywhere, hoping to see Ember and Frost do tricks. He complained to Queen Lyria during one of their private meetings, and she laughed and said that fame was the price of heroism. Daniel grumbled that he preferred obscurity, but bigger problems were emerging, and the human defense station was being built in orbit, and construction crews arrived daily, and some of the elvish population worried that humans were taking over their world despite the treaty limitations. Lord Varen led a group of protesters who gathered in the city plaza and demanded that the Queen reject all human presence. And Daniel watched from a palace window as the crowd grew larger each day. Lady Helena reported during a council meeting that some border villages had refused to allow human survey teams access to the mining areas, and General Caney warned that tensions could escalate into violence. Queen Lyria asked Daniel what he thought, and he said that fear of change was natural, but isolation was dangerous, and Silvara needed allies whether they liked it or not. Amanda Price contacted the palace from the orbital station and said her superiors on Earth were concerned about the protests and were considering pulling back from the treaty entirely. That night, Daniel could not sleep, and he walked through empty palace halls with Ember on one shoulder and Frost on the other, and he thought about how complicated peace could be. Sometimes defeating an enemy was easier than building friendship. The next morning, a human shuttle crashed in the northern forest, and initial reports said mechanical failure, but when rescue teams arrived, they found evidence of sabotage and an explosive device that had been hidden in the cargo bay. 2 human engineers died and 3 others were badly injured. Amanda arrived at the palace angry and demanded answers and accused elvish extremists of terrorism, and Lord Varen denied any involvement and accused humans of staging the incident to justify military occupation. The council chamber erupted into shouting, and Queen Lyria had to call for silence multiple times. Daniel stood quietly in the corner and watched the alliance crumbling before it had truly begun. That evening he visited the crash site alone, and Frost sniffed through the wreckage while Ember circled overhead and Daniel examined the explosive device carefully. The design was not elvish, and it was not human either. It was Kreth technology. He returned to the palace and requested an immediate private meeting with Queen Lyria and Amanda, and told them what he had found. Amanda looked stunned and said that Kreth survivors must have stayed behind after the invasion and were trying to destroy the alliance from within. Lyria asked how many Kreth agents might be hiding on her world, and Daniel said probably a small team and well-trained in sabotage and infiltration. They needed to find the agents quickly before another attack happened. General Caney organized search teams, but Silvara was a large planet with Vast forests and mountain ranges, and finding a few hidden operatives was nearly impossible. Another incident occurred 3 days later, when an elvish supply convoy was attacked, and the drivers reported seeing human weapons and armor. But Daniel examined the site and again found subtle evidence of Kreth involvement. The agents were clever and were trying to make each species blame the other. Public anger grew, and Lord Varen called for Amanda to leave the planet, and some humans wanted to abandon Silvara entirely and let the elves face the next Kreth invasion alone. Daniel realized that military force would not solve this problem, and they needed a different approach. He asked Queen Lyria for permission to address the public directly, and she hesitated because she knew how much he valued privacy, but finally agreed. That evening, Daniel stood on the palace balcony overlooking the main plaza where thousands had gathered, and Ember and Frost perched on the stone railing beside him. Spoke without amplification, but his voice carried clearly to every ear. He told them that he had lived for thousands of years and seen countless wars and conflicts, and had learned that enemies often used fear and suspicion to divide those who should be united. He said that Kreth agents were hiding among them and causing violence to destroy the alliance, because a united Silvara and Earth were a threat to Kreth expansion. He asked the people to reject fear and to trust that humans and elves could build something better together. When he finished speaking, the crowd was silent for a long moment. Then a young elvish woman stepped forward and said she worked at the spaceport and had seen strange activity in one of the abandoned warehouses and figures moving at night who did not match any arrival records. Daniel asked her to show him the location. That night, Daniel and Frost approached the warehouse while Ember circled above, watching for escape routes, and inside, they found 3 Kreth operatives preparing another attack. The Kreth saw Daniel and immediately opened fire, but their weapons could not harm him, and he walked through the energy blasts like they were rain. Frost froze their equipment solid, and Daniel grabbed the lead operative by the throat and demanded to know who had sent them. The Kreth agent spat that the Empire would never stop, and that destroying the Alliance was just the beginning, and more agents were already in place on a dozen worlds. Daniel turned the bow operatives over to General Caney, and Palace Security found evidence of a larger network, and within days most of the Kreth cells on Silvara were captured. The sabotage stopped, and tensions began to ease. Amanda met with Daniel privately and admitted she had doubted whether the alliance could work, and said that his speech had changed many minds, including hers. Daniel said that words only worked when people wanted to believe in something better. She asked if he would be willing to visit Earth and speak to human leadership about the importance of the alliance, and he refused immediately and said he had already done more than he wanted. Amanda smiled and said she had expected that answer, but had to try over. The following week's construction of the defense station continued, and human and elvish workers began cooperating more smoothly, and Lord Varen remained skeptical, but stopped organizing protests. Queen Lyria told Daniel that she was grateful for everything he had done, and understood if he wanted to leave and return to anonymity somewhere else. Daniel looked at Ember and Frost and thought about how this world had grown on him, despite the complications. He said he would stay a while longer and see how things developed. Lyria asked if he would finally accept a proper position and quarters instead of living in the servant wing. Daniel said absolutely not, and he liked his small room and simple life. The Queen shook her head and said he was the strangest dragon lord in all of history. He replied that he would take that as a compliment. That evening, Daniel was mopping the Great Hall when a group of human engineers approached and asked if they could meet his dragons, and he let Ember and Frost perform some aerial tricks, and the engineers laughed and took pictures. An elvish noble watched disapprovingly and muttered that dragon lords should have more dignity. Daniel ignored him and continued mopping. Later he found a quiet corner and sat down, and Frost curled up in his lap while Ember dozed on his shoulder. He thought that building peace was harder than fighting wars and took longer and required more patience. But perhaps that was exactly why old beings like him were needed. Not to fight battles, but to remind people that cooperation was possible and that differences could become strengths. He closed his eyes and listened to his dragons breathing softly. Maybe being a known dragon lord was not so terrible after all, as long as they still let him mop floors. 6 months had passed since the Kreth invasion, and Silvara had changed in ways both large and small, and the human defense station orbited overhead and provided protection while trade ships came and went and brought new ideas and technologies that mixed with elvish traditions. Daniel still worked as a janitor, though everyone knew he was so much more, and he had developed a comfortable routine of cleaning during the day and advising Queen Lyria in the evenings and playing with Ember and Frost whenever he had free time. But peace never lasted forever, and he knew that better than anyone. The trouble started when a merchant ship arrived from the Meridian Consortium and brought news that the Kreth Empire was planning a massive counter-attack, and intelligence suggested they were assembling a fleet 3 times larger than the first invasion force. Amanda Price returned to Silvara from Earth and brought reinforcements, but even human military experts admitted that the coming Kreth force would overwhelm their defenses. Queen Lyria called an emergency council meeting, and Lord Varen argued that they should evacuate the planet, and Lady Helena said running would only delay the inevitable, and General Caney reported that their combined forces could hold for perhaps a week against such numbers. Everyone looked at Daniel and waited. He stood by the window and watched children playing in the palace gardens, and said that 1 dragon lord and 2 dragons could not stop an entire empire, and he was powerful, but not that powerful. Amanda asked if there were other dragon lords who could help, and Daniel said he was the last, and the others had died in the Great War or vanished into the unknown regions. Lyria asked what options they had, and Daniel was silent for a long time. Finally, he said there might be one possibility, but it was dangerous and untested, and would require trusting him completely. The Queen said she had trusted him. This far, Daniel explained that dragon lords had once possessed knowledge of ancient weapons and technologies that had been sealed away after the Great War because they were too destructive, and one such weapon existed on a dead world called Terminus, in the Outer Rim. It was called the Harmony Gate, and it had the power to create a barrier around an entire star system that nothing could pass through, and not even the largest fleet could break. But activating the gate required a dragon lord to bond with it permanently, and whoever did so would become part of the gate itself and could never leave. It was a prison as much as a protection. The council chamber fell silent, and Amanda said they could not ask him to sacrifice himself like that. Daniel smiled and said she was not asking, and he was offering. Lyria stood and said she refused to buy her world's safety with his freedom, and there had to be another way. Daniel looked at her and said that he had lived for thousands of years, and had seen everything he wanted to see, and had learned that some lives were worth spending and protecting this world and its people, and the alliance they had built was worth any price. He had been running from responsibility for centuries, and perhaps it was time to stop running. Frost and Ember flew to his shoulders and chirped sadly because they understood what he was saying. Over the next week, Daniel prepared for the journey to Terminus, and Queen Lyria tried repeatedly to change his mind and offered to evacuate the population or fight to the last or negotiate with the Kreth. But Daniel remained firm and said that running would not save them, and fighting would only lead to death, and the Kreth did not negotiate. He packed very little and mostly spent time walking through the palace and the city and saying goodbye to places he had grown fond of. A young elvish girl named Maya, who often followed him around, gave him a drawing she had made of him and his dragons, and he tucked it carefully into his pocket on the day of departure. Amanda insisted on taking him to Terminus personally, and Queen Lyria came to the landing pad, and the entire palace staff lined up to see him off. Daniel felt embarrassed by the attention and tried to make jokes about how he was just going on a short trip, but nobody laughed. Lyria embraced him and thanked him for everything and said he had taught her that true strength was knowing when to serve others, and he had been the best janitor and advisor she could have asked for. Daniel said she would be a great queen, and she should remember that peace required constant work, and she should never stop building bridges between different peoples. He climbed into the shuttle with Amanda and Ember and Frost, and they launched toward the stars. Journey to Terminus took 3 days, and during that time Daniel taught Amanda everything he knew about the Harmony Gate, and warned her that once he activated it, nobody would be able to reach him. She asked if he was afraid, and he admitted that he was, but some things were more important than fear. They arrived at Terminus, and it was a gray world with no atmosphere, and covered in ancient ruins, and at the center of the largest ruin complex stood a massive archway covered in symbols that glowed faintly. Daniel approached the gate and placed his hands on the stone and spoke words in the Dragon Lord language, and the symbols blazed with light. Ember and Frost flew circles around him and cried out, and he told them they needed to return to Silvara and protect the queen, and they were good dragons and he was proud of them. The dragons understood and landed beside Amanda, and she had tears running down her face. Daniel looked back at her and said that she should take care of Ember and Frost, and they would need a new master, and she should tell everyone that some endings were really beginnings. Then he turned back to the gate, and his body began to glow and merge with the stone light exploded outward, and Amanda had to shield her eyes, and when she could see again, Daniel was gone. The gate pulsed with energy, and she could feel a barrier forming that would expand to encompass the entire Silvara system on. The archway, a new carving appeared, and it showed a man standing between two dragons, back on Silvara. The barrier suddenly shimmered into existence around the planet, and Queen Lyria felt it and knew what had happened, and she went to her balcony and looked up at the stars. When Amanda returned with Ember and Frost, the entire world mourned the loss of their dragon lord, but 3 days later the Kreth fleet arrived and tried to enter the system, and their ships hit the barrier and could not pass through, and no weapon they fired could penetrate it. The fleet commander raged and threatened, but eventually withdrew. Silvara was safe. Queen Lyria made Daniel's small room in the servant quarters into a memorial, and placed the drawing that Maya had made on the wall, and Ember and Frost stayed there often and curled up. On his bed, Amanda decided to remain on Silvara as the permanent human ambassador, and she took responsibility for caring for the dragons years past, and the alliance between humans and elves grew stronger, and other worlds joined, and the barrier around Silvara became legendary. Sometimes people reported seeing a figure in the starlight near the barrier, and they said it looked like a man watching over them. Ember and Frost lived for a very long time, because dragons lived longer when bonded to dragon lords, and they told stories to the young ones about their master who had swept floors and saved worlds. And on quiet nights when 3 moons were full, the barrier would pulse with extra light, and people said that was Daniel reminding them that the smallest people could do the greatest things, and that real heroes were the ones who chose to serve. Queen Lyria grew old by elvish standards, and eventually passed leadership to her daughter, and before she died, she visited the memorial one last time. She whispered thank you to the drawing on the wall and said that his sacrifice had given them time to build something beautiful, and perhaps somewhere in the light of the barrier, Daniel heard her and smiled, because that was all he had ever wanted to give people time to become better. And in the end, the janitor who had hidden among them had taught them the greatest lesson of all. That true nobility was not about power or recognition. It was about choosing to do what was right, even when it cost everything, and Silvara never forgot.